The 8:14 was 3 stops out of the river terminus when the old woman across the aisle made a sound I will never forget. Not a cry, not a word, just a soft, surprised little breath, the kind you make when a step isn't where you thought it was. Then her teacup slid off the fold-down tray and burst on the floor, and she folded sideways into the window like a coat slipping off its hook. I was 26 that winter, and I had never seen a grown person collapse before. I want to be honest about what I did, because it is the whole reason I am telling this. I did nothing. I sat with my phone still glowing in my hand and my mouth open, and a stupid, useless thought going round and round. Somebody should do something. Somebody should do something. As if I were not a somebody, as if there were a list of qualified people and my name was not on it. She was perhaps 80. A small woman in a good wool coat the color of a robin's egg, with a brooch shaped like a sprig of holly and a paper carrier bag at her feet that said BRNWSEKTAROMS in gold. Her hat had come off and rolled under the seat. Her face had gone the gray of old candle wax, and her lips were moving without sound, and one hand was scrabbling at the collar of the coat as if it had grown too tight. The carriage was full. That is the thing people don't understand when they hear the story afterward. There were maybe 40 of us in that car, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same warm diesel and wet wool air, and every single one of us turned to stone. A businessman too seats up half rose and then sat back down. A young father pulled his little boy closer and looked at the ceiling. A woman near the door said, "Oh no, somebody," in a high voice, and then pressed both hands over her mouth as though she had said something rude. The train rocked on. The field slid by white with frost, and the old woman slid further down the glass, and her hand stopped scrabbling at her collar and just lay there open on the wet seat. He came up the aisle before I even saw him stand. That is the part I have gone over 1,000 times. I never saw the beginning of it, the deciding, the rising. One moment the aisle was a wall of frozen people, and the next there was a man moving down it, quick and low and certain, the way water finds the crack in a dam. He had been sitting near the far end by the luggage rack. An ordinary man. That is what I want you to hold on to, because it is the heart of everything. A perfectly ordinary man in a dark green wax jacket gone pale at the cuffs, brown corduroy trousers, walking boots, a gray scarf. Short hair going iron at the temples, maybe 45. He had a paperback in his coat pocket and a thermos in a net bag, and a face you would not have looked at twice. If you had been asked an hour before to point out the most remarkable person in that carriage, you would not have pointed at him. You would have looked straight through him. He knelt in the broken china without a flinch. "Right," he said, and his voice was low and even and somehow took all the panic out of the air around it. "I've got her." He didn't look up, but somehow the word landed on the businessman. "Pull that emergency cord by the door, the red handle. Pull it now and tell the guard a passenger has collapsed. We need the train held at the next platform and an ambulance called to meet it. Go." The businessman went. He nearly fell over his own feet going, but he went. And I understood later that this was the first gift the man in the green jacket gave us. He made us able to move again. He didn't shout. He didn't make a speech. He just handed each frozen person one small clear thing to do, the way you'd pass tools to someone up a ladder, and the doing unfroze them. "You," he said, and now it was me, his eyes coming up and finding mine across the aisle, gray eyes, very calm. "What's your name?" "Cora," I said. It came out as a whisper. "Cora, good. I need you to come and sit by her head. Just there. You're not going to do anything yet but be next to her so she's not alone, all right. People hold on better when they're not alone." And because he said it so simply, as though it were obvious, as though I were obviously the right person, I got up on legs that didn't feel like mine, and I crossed the aisle, and I knelt down in the cold wet by the old woman's head. And I was, for the first time since she made that little breath, not useless. He had already loosened the top button of her coat and the brooch. His hands were unhurried. They did not shake. I have watched a lot of people try to help in the years since, and the thing that marks the ones who actually know from the ones who only want to is the hands, whether the hands hurry. His did not hurry. They went where they meant to go and did one thing at a time. "Madam," he said to her, close to her ear, "can you hear me? Open your eyes for me if you can." Her eyelids fluttered. The gray of her face was frightening. Up close I could see a fine gold chain at her throat and a hearing aid the color of putty in one ear, and a wedding ring worn so thin it was nearly a wire. "She's not, is she?" The young father had crept up behind us with his little boy's hand still in his. "Is she dead?" "No," the man said, without heat, without even looking up, 2 fingers laid against the side of the old woman's throat. "She's got a pulse. It's fast and it's thready and I don't love it, but it's there, and she breathed just then, did you see? She breathed. She's still in there." He said she's still in there the way you'd say it about a house with one lamp lit. "What we're going to do is keep her that way until the people with the equipment arrive. That's the whole job, keeping her in there." I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other thing anyone has ever said to me. That's the whole job, keeping her in there. He had a way of making something enormous and terrifying into a small, flat task you could actually do. The train began to slow. The emergency cord had done its work. Somewhere up the line the guard had radioed ahead. But slowing a train takes time, and the man with the calm hands behaved as though he had all the time in the world and none of it to waste, which I would later learn are not the same thing, and that knowing the difference is most of the art. "Cora," he said, "I want you to do 3 things and I'll tell you them one at a time. First thing, your coat, take it off and we're going to put it under her here, along her side, so when I turn her she's got something soft and she's not lying on cold glass. Can you do that?" I could. I shrugged out of my coat. He lifted the old woman with a gentleness that was almost unbearable to watch, one arm under her shoulders, the other guiding, and I tucked the coat along her, and he laid her back down on it, and for the first time her body looked less like a dropped thing and more like a person lying down. "Good. Second thing. There's a bag at her feet, the Tarum bag, and her handbag's on the seat, black with the clasp. In a lady's handbag of that age there's nearly always a card or a little folded paper with who to call, and there may be a list of her medicines, which the ambulance crew will want before they want almost anything else. Don't tip it out. Just look. Tell me what you find." The handbag smelled of peppermint and powder, and a whole life. There was a coin purse, a comb, a folded handkerchief with an embroidered M, a photograph of a young man in a uniform from a war long over, and exactly where he'd said it would be, a small card in a plastic sleeve, soft at the corners from being carried a long time. I read it out. Her name was Margaret Ellery. There was a number for someone called Dorothy who was her daughter, and underneath, in a careful old hand, a short list. Warfarin, water pills, the heart tablets, small, white under the tongue if the chest goes tight. The man's hand stopped for exactly 1 second when I read asterisk warfarin. Just 1 second. Then they went on. "That's very good, Cora. That's a great deal. You've just made the ambulance crew's job 10 minutes faster, and you've maybe made it possible at all. Keep that card in your hand, don't put it back, they'll want it. Third thing, when the train stops, and it's going to stop in a minute, I need you to be at the doors with the card and tell the crew her name is Margaret, she's on a blood thinner, and we have her medicine list. Just those 3 things. Her name, the blood thinner, the list. Can you hold those 3 things?" "Her name is Margaret, she's on a blood thinner, we have the list," I said. "You're doing well," he said, and he did not say it the way people say it to children. He said it the way one grown person says it to another when it happens to be true, and something in my chest that had been clenched since the teacup broke let go just a little. Then Margaret stopped breathing. I knew it before he said anything, because I was watching her face, and the small movement at her nostrils that I had not even known I was relying on simply ceased, and her chest under the robin's egg coat went still. The young father made a noise behind me. The woman by the doors began to cry. And the man in the green jacket, I never did get his name from his own mouth. You'll see why. Leaned down, put his cheek a hand's breadth from her lips, looked along the line of her chest for the length of a slow count, and then moved. There was no panic in it. I have to keep saying that, because the absence of panic is the thing that saved her, and it is the rarest thing in the world when the worst is happening. He tipped her head back with 2 fingers under the chin and the flat of his hand on her forehead. Opening the airway, he said, not to me, to all of us, narrating in a low, steady voice so that the watching carriage became, without anyone deciding it, a kind of crew, and the moment he did, her chest hitched and dragged in a breath of its own, an ugly snoring breath, but a breath. There she is, he said softly. The tongue had gone back, that's all it was. Her own body wants to breathe. I just have to keep the door open for it. And he held her head in that exact position, his hand absolutely steady, the train swaying under us, his knees in the broken china and the spilled tea soaking into his corduroy. And he did not move that hand for the next 4 minutes, and I understood that I was watching a man do the simplest and the most difficult thing at once. Hold still, and keep holding still, while everything in him surely wanted to do something bigger and more dramatic and less useful. If she stops again, he said to me conversationally as though we were discussing the weather, and her chest stops moving, I'm going to need to breathe for her, and then I'll need your hands on her chest. And I'll show you exactly where and exactly how hard, and you'll be able to do it, because it's not complicated, it's just frightening, and frightening isn't the same as complicated. But she hasn't stopped. Look, she's pulling air, so we're not there. We hope we don't go there. We're ready if we do. That's all ready means, knowing the next thing and being calm enough to do it. I have built a great deal of my life on that sentence since. Frightening isn't the same as complicated. The brakes came on hard. The train was pulling into the platform now, the long gray shed of it sliding up outside the windows, faces on the platform turning to look at the carriage that had stopped wrong, with its emergency lights on. Through the glass I could see, blessedly, the flat hats of 2 paramedics and a wheeled stretcher, already running. Doors, the man said. Cara, the doors, your 3 things. Go. I went to the doors with Margaret's soft old card held in front of me like a ticket, and when they hissed open and the cold platform air poured in, I said, in a voice I did not recognize as mine because it did not shake, her name is Margaret Ellery. She's on warfarin, a blood thinner, and we have her whole medicine list. It's here. And the lead paramedic, a woman with gray at her temples too, looked at me for half a second with an expression I would not understand until much later, a kind of surprised respect, and said, That's the best handover I've had all week, love. Where is she? There, I said, with the man. He's been keeping her breathing. We came back down the aisle together, and I watched the paramedics arrive at Margaret's side, and I watched the man in the green jacket do the last thing, the thing I think about most. He did not stand up and step back and let the professionals take over with a flourish, the way you'd expect, the way it happens in films. He stayed exactly where he was, his hand still cradling Margaret's head in the open airway position, and he gave the paramedics the handover himself, fast and flat and complete, without once letting go of her. Female, I'd say early 80s, sudden collapse maybe 9 minutes ago, brief loss of breathing twice, both times the tongue, both resolved on positioning, pulse present throughout but fast and weak. I'd been making it around 1:30, irregular. She's on warfarin and a diuretic, GTN under the tongue for angina per her list, so I haven't given anything. No trauma from the fall, she went down soft against the window. She's had no fluids, no medication from us. Airway's the issue, not the heart, or not only the heart, but you'll see that better than me. The lead paramedic was kneeling opposite him now, her own hands coming in, and she said, and this is the moment I knew, though I didn't yet know what I knew, got it. On 3, let me take the head from you, keep that exact angle. And they swapped the holding of Margaret's head between them as smoothly as 2 people who had done it 1,000 times, his hand sliding out as hers slid in so that the angle never changed by a hair. And the paramedic said, almost under her breath. Not really a question. You've done this before. A bit, the man said. More than a bit, she said, looking at his hands, looking at his face. You medical? No, he said. And he picked up his thermos in its net bag from where it had rolled under the seat and his paperback, and he wiped his wet hands on his already wet trousers, and he became, in front of my eyes, ordinary again. I'm not anything. I just learned to do that a long time ago in a job where you couldn't ever be the one who froze. He looked down at Margaret, whose eyes were open now, open and moving and bewildered and alive. She's a tough one, he said gently to her, not about her. You gave us a fright, Margaret. These good people are going to look after you now. Your Dorothy's been called. You're all right. And the old woman's thin hand came up off the stretcher and inched toward him, and he took it and held it for exactly as long as it takes to make a promise, and then he laid it down on the blanket they'd put over her and let it go. They lifted her onto the platform with great care, and the doors stood open, and the carriage that had been a frozen tomb 10 minutes before was suddenly full of noise. Relief makes people loud, everyone talking at once, the woman by the doors laughing and crying together, the businessman shaking the young father's hand for no reason either of them could have named, a sort of giddy survivor's warmth running up and down the aisle. People wanted to thank the man. They were turning toward him, 2 or 3 of them already reaching, and the businessman was saying, Mate, you were incredible, what's your... But the man wasn't there to be thanked. He was crouched by the seat with a wad of paper napkins from someone's lunch, mopping up the worst of the spilled tea and the broken china off the floor, because, he said, when the conductor came through, someone would slip on it. He gathered the bigger shards into a folded newspaper so no one would cut a hand. He found Margaret's hat under the seat and her little holly brooch where it had come loose, and he put them in the gold tearoom bag with the rest of her things, and he handed the bag to the paramedics through the open door. Her bag. She'll want her own things at the hospital, the photo especially, I'd guess. And he asked them, quietly, which hospital, and wrote nothing down, just nodded. You should come in too, the lead paramedic told him, pausing on the step. Give a proper statement. They'll want to know what you did exactly when. It matters for her treatment. I'll write it for you, he said, and he took a page out of the back of his paperback, the blank flyleaf, and he wrote on it against the window in a small square hand times, breaths, the pulse he'd counted, the medicines he hadn't given and why, a clean clinical record of 9 minutes, and he handed it across, and that was the only writing he did, and it had no name at the bottom. The paramedic read it on the step, and her eyebrows went up, and she looked back at him one more time and she said, You're sure you're not going to tell me where you learned this? In the rain, mostly, he said, and smiled for the first time, and it changed his whole ordinary face, standing still in the rain. You'd be surprised what a man learns to notice when standing still is the entire job. Doors began their warning beep. The train was going to go on. They'd already arranged to move Margaret's onward arrangements in hours, and the rest of us were being told we could stay aboard. The man stepped back from the doors. And here is the thing I did, the one good quick thing I did in the whole affair, the thing I am proud of. As the doors started to close, I stepped half out onto the platform with him, because I could not bear for him to simply dissolve into the crowd, and I said, Please, I'm Cora. You never told me your name. He looked at me, and there was something kind and a little tired in it. Does it matter? He said. You did it, Cora. You sat by her head when she was alone. You found her name. You gave the best handover that woman's had all week, she said so. If anyone asks who helped Margaret today, you say a carriage full of people did, the moment one person showed them how. That's the truer story anyway. It isn't though, I said. It was you. They were going to thank you and you tidied up broken china instead. People don't do that. He picked up his net bag with the thermos in it. Some people do, he said. The unglamorous half of helping is most of helping. Anybody can be a hero for 30 seconds when there's a camera. The job, the real job, is the part nobody films. Mopping the tea so the conductor doesn't fall. standing in the rain for 4 hours after the parade's gone home. He stopped, as though he'd said one word too many, and his mouth quirked. "You should get back on. Your train's leaving." And it was. The beep had become a steadier tone. I stepped back across the gap, and the doors closed between us, and the last I saw of him on that platform he had turned away, an ordinary man in a worn green jacket with a thermos in a net bag, walking against the flow of the crowd toward the far exit, already, somehow, invisible again. And I stood with my forehead nearly against the cold glass and watched him go, and felt that I had let something rare walk away from me without ever learning what it was. I did not learn what it was for 2 months. What I had in the meantime was his sentence. Standing in the rain, you'd be surprised what a man learns to notice. And his other one, a job where you couldn't ever be the one who froze. And the way he'd known, without being told, that an old woman's handbag would hold a medicine list. The way his hands had not hurried. The way he'd turned 40 frozen strangers into a crew by handing each of us one small clear thing to do. I turned these over on the long ride home, and for many evenings after, the way you worry at a knot, and I could not make them come loose into a picture. Soldier, I thought, but not quite a soldier. Doctor, the paramedic had asked, and he'd said no, and I believed him. A lifeguard, a mountain rescuer, a fireman. None of it fit the green jacket and the paperback and the strange, ceremonial care he'd taken even with broken china. As if tidiness and stillness and standing in the rain were not chores to him, but something closer to a faith. I told the story a great deal. You tell a story like that, you can't help it. And every time I told it, the same 2 things happened. People asked who he was, and I had to say I didn't know, and people said asterisk how amazing that a stranger knew what to do, and I would think, no, that's wrong, that's the part you've got backwards. The amazing thing was not that he knew what to do. Plenty of people know what to do. The amazing thing was that he was calm enough to actually do it, and humble enough to vanish before anyone could pin a medal on him for it. The knowing is taught in an afternoon. The calm and the vanishing are taught by a whole life. Margaret Ellery lived. I knew because I had given my own number to the paramedics on the platform, in case anyone needed a witness, and 3 weeks later I got a careful, old-fashioned letter, blue ink on cream paper, in the same hand I'd seen on the card in her handbag. "Dear Miss Cora," asterisk it began, "for I never did hear your surname, though the ambulance lady gave me your name, and said you were the one who sat by my head and told them my tablets." She had had what the doctors called a serious turn of the heart, and a clot the warfarin had been holding off had been the trouble, and they had told her, she wrote this plainly, the way the very old often can, that if her airway had closed for even a little longer than it did, she would not be writing me a letter at all. "They tell me," she wrote, "that the gentleman kept the breathing road open. I should very much like to thank him, but no one seems to know who he was, and it grieves me, for a person ought to be thanked. If you ever should learn his name, you will tell me, won't you? Until then I thank his hands. I felt them. I was not as far gone as everyone thought, you know. I heard a great deal of it. I heard him call you Cora and tell you that you were doing well, and I heard him say the whole job was keeping me in there. And I want you to know that I held on to that sentence in the dark the way you hold a rail on a moving train. I was, I think, deciding whether to stay, and that sentence helped me decide. So you see I should like to thank his hands." Dorothy says I am being sentimental. Dorothy was not there. I wrote back. I told her everything I could remember, which was a great deal, because I had told it so often. I told her about the broken china he'd tidied, and the medicine list he'd known would be there, and the rain he'd said he'd learned it in. And I told her I would never stop trying to find out who he was, and that when I did, she would be the first to know, even before me somehow, if I could manage it. Then in March I found out, and it was the smallest thing in the world that did it. I was walking through the old part of the city on an errand, a route I never took, and I came up a narrow street I didn't know and out into a great cobbled square in front of a pair of tall iron gates, and behind the gates, in the bright cold light, A row of ceremonial guards stood their post. You will know the picture even if you have never seen it in life. The tall black bearskin caps, the red wool tunics with their double row of brass buttons polished to fire, the white gloves, the medals, the rifle held just so. The absolute stillness of men trained not to move while the whole busy world flowed past and gawped and held up phones and tried, the way people do, to make them flinch. A crowd was pressed to the railings. A man was leaning over the rope making faces at the nearest guard, and his friends were laughing, and the guard did not so much as blink, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, a statue in red and black, a symbol of a discipline so total it looked, from the outside, like a man feeling nothing at all. I had stopped to watch the way you do. And then the watch changed. It happens on a schedule, the changing of the guard, with a sergeant and a relief and a great deal of slow stamping ceremony. And I stayed for it because it was beautiful in the way that anything done perfectly is beautiful. The relieved man, the one the tourist had been mocking, turned at last, his hour of stone over, and marched off with the others off the public stage, toward a low stone door in the wall of the courtyard. And as he passed nearest the railings, no more than 10 feet from me, in the half-second before he reached the door and the world that was not allowed to see his face, his eyes came down off the middle distance for one instant and crossed the crowd, and crossed me, and stopped. It was him. I knew the eyes before I let myself believe the rest. Gray, very calm. The iron at the temples was under the bearskin now, and I could not see the green jacket or the thermos or the worn cuffs, but it was the man from the 8:14, the man who had knelt in the broken china and kept Margaret breathing and tidied the tea and walked away invisible, and he was not invisible at all, it turned out. He was one of the most looked-at men in the country. He just stood as looking at in a uniform so loud that nobody ever saw the man inside it, and then took the uniform off and became, on a cold commuter train, the most invisible person in the carriage, which is its own kind of discipline, the discipline of being unremarkable, and perhaps the harder of the two. He did not break his march. Of course he did not. He was on duty, the line of him never wavered, his face stayed forward and still. But in that half-second his eyes had found me and known me, Cora, you sat by her head, and one corner of his mouth moved, a fraction, the ghost of the smile he'd given the paramedic on the platform, standing still in the rain. You'd be surprised what a man learns to notice. And then he was through the low door and gone, and the whole thing had taken less time than it takes to read this sentence. And I was standing at the railings of the most famous gate in the city with my hand over my mouth and tears standing in my eyes, because I had found him, and because of everything that finding him explained. A job where you couldn't ever be the one who froze, of course. He stood for hours, motionless in front of crowds who tried to make him crack, in rain and in heat, while drunks shouted and tourists jeered and children waved, and nothing was permitted to move him. That was the school of his calm. The thing that had looked in the carriage like an almost unnatural steadiness under pressure was simply Tuesday to him. He had spent his working life learning to stand absolutely still while the worst the public could throw rolled off him, and then a real emergency had come, a true one, a woman dying, and he had reached for the only thing he had a whole life of practice in, which was not freezing, and he had been, for 9 minutes on a train, exactly the man the rest of us turned to stone wishing we could be. Standing still in the rain. You'd be surprised what a man learns to notice. He had not been being mysterious. He had been telling me the literal truth. The stillness of his post was not emptiness. It was attention, total, trained, unbroken attention, the kind that, drilled into a man for years, lets him see across a packed train carriage that an old woman's hand has stopped scrabbling at her collar, and read in a half-second the difference between a faint and a death. I did not try to chase him through the low stone door. You don't, with a man like that. I'd learned that much on the platform. Instead, I wrote a letter, and I addressed it carefully, not to a name I didn't have, but to the off-duty guardsman who helped a lady named Margaret Ellery on the 14 in January * care of the regiment at that gate, and I sealed inside it Margaret's own letter, the cream paper and the blue ink, the one that said I should very much like to thank his hands, for I felt them. I was not as far gone as everyone thought. I added a single line of my own. She lived. She wrote this. A person ought to be thanked. Cora, who sat by her head, and I posted it, and I did not really expect an answer, because I had come to understand that the not being thanked was, for him, part of the thing itself, as much as the standing in the rain. He answered, not in writing. He did better than writing. It was Margaret who told me, in a telephone call, her old voice bright as a girl's. A few weeks after I posted my letter, on an ordinary afternoon, a man had come to her door. An ordinary man, she said, in a worn green jacket, with a thermos in a net bag, holding a small bunch of holly because he'd remembered her brooch. Imagine remembering the brooch, she said, with everything else he had to remember that day. He had not announced himself as anyone. He had said only that he was the fellow from the train, and that he'd heard she'd been asking, and that a person ought to be thanked but it ought to go the other way round, that he'd come to thank her, for being a tough one, for deciding to stay, for holding on to a sentence in the dark. And he had sat in her front room for an hour and let her give him weak tea in the good cups and a slice of cake she'd made specially, and he had admired the photograph of the young man in uniform, her late husband. It turned out, gone 40 years, and when she had pressed him gently, in the way the very old are allowed to press, about what he did, he had told her. He had told her he stood at a gate. And Margaret, who had lived 81 years and was nobody's fool, had looked at this man in his worn jacket in her small front room and understood the whole of it at once, and she had said to him. She repeated it to me on the phone, and I could hear her smiling. Then I have been kept alive by a king's man. Well, I always knew the standing still ones were the steady kind. My Albert was a standing still one, you can always tell. And he had laughed, she said, the real laugh, the one that changed his face. And then he had washed up his own teacup at her sink before she could stop him. Of course he did, I thought. The unglamorous half of helping is most of helping. And he had checked, without making anything of it, that her tablets were in their little box by the kettle, and that she knew which was the small white one for under the tongue. And he had written the hospital's number large on a card and propped it where she'd see it. And he had said that if it was all the same to her he'd look in now and again, just passing. No fuss. And then he had let himself out, an ordinary man with an empty net bag, and disappeared up her quiet street the way he'd disappeared up the platform, against the flow, invisible, complete. He did look in, now and again. He looks in still. Margaret is 90 now and frailer, and there is a tall, quiet man who comes by her door on the days he is off the post, in his green jacket with his thermos, and he changes the bulb she can't reach and reads her the letters her eyes have got too poor for and sits with her in the afternoons that would otherwise be very long, and he has never once in 9 years let her tell anyone his name. I know it now, she told me, and I have kept it, and I will keep it here too, because it was never the point. The point is the hands. The point is that there is a man who spends his working hours being the most looked at and least known person in the country, standing like a statue in red and black, so that the world can photograph the discipline and never once meet the man, and that on his days off he puts on a coat with worn cuffs and becomes nobody at all, and carries that same discipline out into the ordinary world where there is no crowd and no camera and no parade, and uses it on a dying stranger on a commuter train, and then mops up the spilled tea so the conductor won't fall and goes home and tells no one. I think about the carriage often, the 40 of us turned to stone, and the one man who wasn't. For a long time I was ashamed of my own freezing, of the phone glowing useless in my hand, of the thought going round and round, somebody should do something. I am less ashamed now because of what he gave me, which was not just Margaret's life but a smaller, more lasting thing. He taught me in 9 minutes that the difference between the people who help and the people who freeze is almost never knowledge and almost never courage. It is calm. And calm is not something you are born with and the rest of us aren't. It is something you build, the way he built it in the rain at a post, doing a small hard thing over and over until the doing of small hard things becomes the deepest part of you. So that when the enormous thing comes, you do not have to find the calm because you have already become it, and your hands, when they reach for a dying stranger, do not hurry and do not shake and know the way. I gave a different handover than that paramedic asked for in the end. Not the one on the platform, her name is Margaret, she's on a blood thinner, we have the list. The other one. The one I have given 100 times since, to anyone who will listen, in the hope that it unfreezes one person somewhere the way one man unfroze a whole carriage. It goes like this. When the worst is happening and everyone around you has turned to stone, do not wait for the qualified person. There may not be one coming. Be the one who moves first. You do not have to know everything, you only have to start and hand the next person one small clear thing to do, and then the next, until the frozen room becomes a crew. Stay beside the one who's alone so they're not. Find out their name. And afterward, this is the part the films leave out, and the part that tells you who a person really is. Wipe up the broken china so the next person through doesn't fall, and slip away before anyone can pin a medal on you, because the helping was the reward and there is no other one worth having. That is the whole job, he'd said, kneeling in the tea and the broken china with his hand keeping an old woman's airway open while the train rocked on through the white fields, keeping her in there. He did not mean only Margaret. I have come to think he meant all of us, the whole frightened, frozen carriage of us, that the off-duty hands that helped her that morning were, without one of us seeing it then, keeping the rest of us in there too, in the place where people still kneel for strangers, where the steady ones step forward, where an ordinary man in a worn green coat is, when you finally see him, the least ordinary thing in the world. His train left without thanks, it always does. But Margaret is 90 and bakes a cake on the anniversary every January and sets out the good cups, and a tall, quiet man in a green jacket comes and washes his own up at her sink before he goes. And I think that is the truer story, the way he said it would be. A carriage full of people helped a lady named Margaret. The moment one steady man, off duty and out of uniform, knelt down in the broken china and showed us how.